The first thing the town of Belle Prairie, Minnesota learned about Almira Stauffer was that she had shipped an Anvil out ahead of herself. And the second thing they learned was what she weighed. And they got both facts inside of 4 minutes on the platform of the St. Paul, Minneapolis and Manitoba Depot on the morning of the 22nd of May, 1882. The Anvil came first, because freight comes off before people do. It came out of the end door of the car in a pine crate with rope handles nailed to it, and it came out badly. Because the two men rolling freight that morning took it for a crate of dry goods and put a hand truck under one corner of it the way you do. And the hand truck went over sideways and the crate came down on the platform boards with a sound that everybody in Belle Prairie heard. A flat, enormous whump that went up through the soles of your feet and set the loose window glass of the depot ringing in its putty. The station agent came out with his sleeve protectors on and his pen still in his hand. He looked at the crate. He looked at the two freight men, who were looking at each other. He walked around the crate once and read the tag that was wired to the rope handle. And then he read it again. And then he said the thing that started it all, which was 212 pounds. What in the name of God is in there? And a voice behind him, a woman's voice, low and unhurried, and coming from the direction of the coach steps, said, "An Anvil. Please don't let them stand it on end. The horn will take a chip out of your boards." That is how they met her. Half the town turned around at once. It was train day. Train day in a wheat town 4 years old is the whole of the week's entertainment, and there were 60 or 70 people on and around that platform, because the westbound brought the mail and the newspapers and the Chicago catalogs and, twice that spring, a piano. And every one of those 60 or 70 people turned around and got their first look at Almira Stauffer standing on the bottom step of a Manitoba road day coach, with her hand on the iron rail and her carpetbag hanging from her other hand, and the laughing started before she had got both feet on the boards. Because she was very heavy. There is no way to tell this story without saying it plainly at the front, and she never in her life allowed anybody to say it delicately in her hearing, so it will be said plainly here. She was 27 years old that spring. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall. She weighed 302 pounds, which she knew to the pound because she had weighed herself on her father's shop scale on the last morning she ever stood in her father's shop, and she had written the number in the front of the ledger she carried under her father's last entry, because she had a mind that liked to know where things stood. She was broad through the shoulder in the particular way that is not fat, and heavy everywhere else in the way that is. Her upper arms were as big around as a stovepipe and hard as a green log underneath. Her hands were wide and short-fingered, and there was a shine of old burned scar across the back of the right one, where a scale of hot iron had gone down inside her glove when she was 15, and she had finished the heat before she took the glove off. She had a round, full face and a double chin and a wide mouth and gray-brown eyes that were very steady, and dark brown hair that she wore pinned up under a faded red cotton kerchief instead of a bonnet, because a bonnet catches sparks and a kerchief you can slap out. She wore a brown calico dress that had been let out twice and turned once, and a man's coat over it, and boots that were a man's boots, and she came down that coach step the way heavy people come down a high step, 1 foot at a time with a hand on the rail, and she took her time about it and let them all watch her take it, because there was no help for it, and there never had been. The laughing came forward through the crowd from the back the way fire goes through cured grass. Somebody at the freight door said, "Loud enough to carry." Well, no wonder the crate come off the truck. They had to counterweight the car. That got a real roar. A boy of about 11, delighted, went and stood beside the crate and put his hand flat on top of it and looked back and forth between the crate and the woman with his mouth open, doing the arithmetic out loud, and the two freight men lost the last of their composure entirely. Almira Stauffer set her carpetbag down on the boards. She straightened her coat. She looked out over that crowd with a face that gave them nothing at all, no anger and no shame and no appeal, and she waited for it to run out, the way you wait out weather. It took a while. It always takes a while. When it had thinned to the point where a person could be heard, she turned to the station agent, who had gone red to the ears and was pretending to study his tag, and she said, "I'll want that crate held here a day or two until I have a place to put it. I'll pay storage. And I'd take it kindly if nobody tried to move it again without me, because it isn't crated to be moved that way and somebody is going to break a foot." The agent said he would hold it. She thanked him. Then she asked him the question she had come 340 miles and spent nearly everything she had to ask, and she asked it in the same flat voice, which was, "Is there a man named Alva Prine here to meet the train?" The platform went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when everybody in it knows a thing at once. There was no Alva Prine on that platform. There had not been an Alva Prine in Belle Prairie for 5 weeks. What there was, coming through the crowd with his hat in his hands and his ears scarlet, was a boy of about 16 named Gustav Lem, who worked at the livery and who had been given a folded paper and a nickel and instructions he had been dreading since Tuesday, and who came up to her and held the paper out at the full stretch of his arm as if it might go off. She took it. She read it standing up, in front of everybody, which she said afterward she should not have done and would not do again. It was 4 lines long. It said that he was sorry. It said that the note on his place had been called in the first week of April, and that he had not been able to make it good, and that the land and the team and the plow had been sold at the courthouse door in Crookston on the 28th, and that he had gone west to the Coeur d'Alene country with 2 other men to look for work in the mines and did not know when he would be back or whether. It said that he had written to her twice to stop her coming, and that the letters must have crossed her on the road. It said in the last line, in a hand that had got worse as it went, that she was a better correspondent than he had deserved, and that he hoped she would not think too hard of him. And folded inside it there was a $10 bill. That is what she was holding on the platform at Belle Prairie, a piece of paper and $10 and a carpet bag, with 212 pounds of her father's Anvil in a crate at her feet and 60 people looking at her. 340 miles from anybody who knew her name. Somebody said, in a kind of hushed carrying whisper, "Well, he's seen her first, I guess." She folded the note along its own creases and put it in the pocket of her coat. Then she picked up her carpet bag, and she asked the station agent whether there was a boarding house in the town that took women, and he said there was. Mrs. Dowd's, the white house with the 2 lilac bushes, 2nd Street back. And she thanked him, and she walked down the platform steps and along the plank sidewalk and up the middle of the street of Belle Prairie, Minnesota, in front of all of them, at her own pace, which was not fast. She was not crying. She wanted to be somewhere she could, and she was aware, in the practical part of her mind that never entirely shut off, that she had $10.80 in the world, and that crying was going to have to wait for after she knew what a bed cost. Now it has to be said what Belle Prairie was, because the town matters as much as the woman does in what follows. It was 4 years old. It sat on the flat black bottom of the old glacial lake in the Red River Valley of the North, in country so level that a man standing on a wagon seat could see the smoke of a threshing engine 9 miles off, and the soil under it was a black clay loam 3 feet deep, with no stone in it anywhere. Not a pebble, not a fist-sized rock in 40 sections, which is a thing people from stony country cannot picture, and which mattered enormously to what happened later. There was no timber except a fringe of box elder and willow along the river 3 miles east. There was no coal. There was no stone. Everything hard in that country had come in on the railroad, and the railroad had come through in 78, and behind it in 4 years had come wheat. Nothing but wheat. Section after section of it, plowed out of raw prairie by men who had never seen ground like it and who went a little drunk on the first crop. Hard red spring wheat that ran 30 bushels to the acre in a decent year on land that cost $5, and the whole valley from Moorhead to the border had gone into it the way a room goes into a fire. Belle Prairie in 1882 had 2 grain elevators standing on the siding like a pair of tall wooden towers, a hardware, a general store, a bank in a building with an iron front shipped from Chicago, a hotel, a newspaper, 3 saloons, a lumber yard, a Norwegian Lutheran church, and a Methodist one, a schoolhouse, and 1 blacksmith shop. 1. That number is the hinge of this entire story, so it is worth sitting on for a second. 1 blacksmith shop. For a town of 400 people, and for every farm inside a 9-mile haul, in a country where every single thing that touched the ground was iron, and every single piece of iron was being worked past what it was built for. Plowshares that wore to a nub in that gritless black clay in a season and had to be laid up again with new steel. Harrow teeth. Wagon tires that had to be shrunk on and reset. Single trees and double trees and neck yokes. Pump rods. Well, casing. Binder knives and sickle sections, and the new twine binders that were coming into that valley in 1882 and breaking in ways nobody had a manual for yet. And, at the end of every August, the threshing outfits, which were machines made out of 1,000 pieces of malleable and wrought and cast iron, running at speeds nothing on a farm had ever run at before, in a shower of grit. 20 hours a day, for 6 weeks. All of it came to one door. The door belonged to Anvil Byrne, and Anvil Byrne is the other person you need to know about before this goes any further. He was 48 that spring. He had come out from Ontario by way of Wisconsin, and he had put up the first frame building in Belle Prairie ahead of the elevator and ahead of the bank, and he was, in his own estimation, and in the town's, a considerable man. He was big himself, 6 feet and heavy through the chest, and gone thick around the middle, bald on top and sunburned there, with gray side whiskers he kept trimmed, and a black leather apron he kept oiled, and he had the trick some tradesmen have of making his shop the social center of a place. There were 2 benches by the door where men sat, and a stove and a checkerboard, and Anvil Byrne holding forth over the ring of the hammer for 11 hours a day. And here is the thing that has to be said fairly, because this story is not improved by making him a fool. He was a very good farrier. He had hands for a horse. He could look at a foot that had been shod wrong by 3 men in a row and tell you in a minute what had been done to it, and he could hot-fit a shoe to a bad hoof better than anybody within 60 miles, and he had never in 11 years lamed an animal. Half the county's teams walked sound because of him, and he knew it, and he had a right to know it. What he was not was a maker. He had learned his trade in a livery town where the work was shoes and light repairs, and he had never been taught to weld properly, which is a specific and difficult thing that has to be learned young at somebody's elbow. And he had never done machine work, and he had a bad habit that every smith who cannot weld eventually develops, which is that he had convinced himself that a weld is a poor way to fix anything and that a bolt and a strap is better. So, when a broken thing came in his door that could not be helped with a bolt and a strap, he said it could not be helped at all, and told the man to write to the factory. And the man wrote to the factory, and nobody in Belle Prairie ever knew any different, because there was no other shop in Belle Prairie to know different from. That was the town Almira Stauffer walked up the middle of on the 22nd of May, 1882, with $10.80 in her pocket, and it is not too much to say that she was, right at that moment, the answer to a question the town had been asking for 4 years without ever once being able to put it into words. They had, of course, no idea. What they had was a fat woman off a train and a very funny afternoon. Orpha Dowd's boarding house was the White House with the 2 lilacs, and Orpha Dowd was sitting on the porch of it shelling last year's beans into a pan when Almira came up the walk. She was 61. She was thin as a rake handle and burned brown, and she had buried 2 husbands, one in Vermont and one in this county. And she ran 6 rooms and a table and had a reputation in Belle Prairie for a tongue that took the varnish off. She watched the whole approach without getting up. Then she said, "You're the one off the train. I am. Prine's gone to Idaho." "So I understand." Orpha Dowd set the pan down on the boards. $2 a week for the little room at the back, she said. 3 with the table. "I don't do sheets more than once a fortnight, and I don't allow drink, and I don't ask questions, and I'll tell you right now that the bed in the back room has a rope frame that I would not trust. and you and I are going to have to take the mattress off it and put it on the floor. And if that troubles you, we can be done talking now and save us both." Almira Stauffer looked at her for about 2 seconds. Then she said, "No, ma'am. It doesn't trouble me, and I'd rather sleep on a floor than through one," and Orpha Dowd made a short sound through her nose that was as close as she came to laughing at anything, and that was the beginning of the most important friendship of Almira Stauffer's life. She paid a week that left $8.80. She sat on the mattress on the floor of the little back room with the door shut, and she took the folded note out of her coat pocket and read it 4 more times, and then she cried for about 11 minutes with a towel over her face so it would not carry through the wall, and then she washed her face in the basin and went down and asked Mrs. Dowd where she could hire a dray. Now, to understand what she did in the next 4 months, you have to know where she came from, and the short of it is that Almira Stauffer had been a blacksmith striker since she was 11 years old. Her father was Caspar Stauffer of Zanesville, Ohio, on the Muskingum, and he had a shop on the canal bank 2 doors up from a cooperage. And he had come over from the Palatinate as a boy of 9 and been bound to a smith at 12 and worked at the fire for 51 years. He was a general smith of the old kind, which meant he could do anything: shoes and wagon work and edge tools and mill work, and because Zanesville had furnaces and rolling mills and a boatyard, a great deal of machine work. Shafting and cranks and eye bolts and drawbars, the sort of thing that requires a man to be able to weld heavy iron and to have it hold under load in front of people who will find out immediately if it does not. He had 4 children. 2 girls died small. The son, Emmett, who was to have the shop, took typhoid out of the canal water in the autumn of 1866 and died at 14 years old on a Sunday afternoon, and there is a straight line from that Sunday to everything in this story. Because Caspar Stauffer needed a striker. A striker is not an apprentice, though an apprentice often does it. A striker is the second pair of arms at the anvil. The smith holds the work in the tongs and directs with a hand hammer, tapping where he wants the blow, and the striker swings the sledge, 8 pounds, or 10, or 16, and lands it where the little hammer said, over and over at the smith's rhythm, for as long as the heat lasts. There is nothing skilled about it in the first month, and there is nothing but skill in it after the first year. Because a striker who is a half-inch off or a beat late will ruin work faster than a bad fire will, and a striker who can be trusted doubles what a shop can do. You cannot hire one in a town of 800 people if you have no money. What Caspar Stauffer had was a daughter of 11 who was already big, and who was in the shop anyway because her mother was dead by then too, and there was nowhere else to put her. He started her on a 4-pound hammer on a piece of cold bar, making her hit a chalk mark 100 times running while he counted. She was 12 before he let her strike on real work, and 13 before he let her strike on a weld. By the time she was 16, she could swing a 12-pound sledge for the length of 3 heats without her rhythm falling off. And by the time she was 20, she was not striking anymore. She was smithing, and her father was striking for her on the heavy jobs, which he did without one word of complaint for the last 9 years of his life, and which several men in Zanesville thought was an outrage and said so. She was, in other words, not a woman who took up blacksmithing. She was a blacksmith who happened to be a woman, trained from 11, in a shop that did hard work in a hard town. And there were maybe 200 people in the state of Ohio who could weld heavy iron as well as she could, and every one of them was a man over 40 who had learned it the exact same way she had. And she was heavy from girlhood. That is worth putting next to the rest of it, because in the shop it was never once a disadvantage, and everywhere else in her life it was the first fact about her. At the anvil, weight is help. The blow you land is the mass you put behind it, and a striker of 120 pounds is working at the top of herself all day, while a striker of 280 is working at half and can still be working at half at 6 in the evening. Her father used to say, in his accent, that God had made his daughter the way you would make a sledge if you were making one, heavy in the head and long in the handle, and a very poor thing to look at, which was the only joke he ever made about her size. and which she repeated all her life, laughing, because he had meant it as praise, and she had always taken it that way. The town of Zanesville did not take it that way. She had one offer of marriage in her 20s from a widower with a hernia who wanted somebody to lift his mother, and she said no. Caspar Stauffer died on the 9th of January, 1882, of a lung thing he had had for 6 years, sitting up in a chair by the shop stove at 4 in the afternoon with the fire banked, and within 11 days it was clear that the shop was gone. He had borrowed against it in '78 to buy iron in a year when iron was dear, and there was $310 against a shop and lot worth about $600, and the note was held by a man in Zanesville who had wanted that lot on the canal bank for 4 years and who moved on the estate before the ground had thawed enough to bury her father in it. She did not fight it. There was nothing to fight with. What she did instead, on the evening of the day the paper came, was take a lamp and go 3 blocks in the sleet to the house of a lawyer named Prather, who had been at her father's fire twice a week for 20 years to warm his feet and argue, and she asked him one question, which was whether the tools were part of the shop. They were not. Under the statutes of the state of Ohio, as they stood in 1882, the tools of a mechanic's trade to a stated value were exempt from execution for debt. Prather looked it up for her in his own book with his finger on the line and showed her the words, and she read them herself twice. And she said, "Thank you." And she went home and did not sleep. And at first light she went down to the shop with a lantern and a piece of chalk and began marking everything she was entitled to carry out the door. She was allowed the tools. She was not allowed the building, or the coal, or the iron in the rack, or the stock of finished work, or the shop scale, though she stood on the scale one last time before she left it and wrote the number in the ledger. What she took out of that shop, and what she paid the freight on, was this: her father's anvil, a Peter Wright of 212 pounds, with his own mark punched into the side of the base in 11 blows, which he had bought second-hand in 1852, and which was the single most valuable object in her life. A leg vise, 2 hand hammers, a cross peen, and a ball peen, worn to fit 2 different hands, a 10-pound sledge, and a 16. 9 pairs of tongs, flat bit and bolt and pickup and hollow bit, which is a whole education by itself, because a smith makes his own tongs to fit the work he does, and 9 pairs of a dead man's tongs is 9 pieces of information about him. Top and bottom fullers, 3 swages, 2 hardies, a hot cut and a cold cut, a flatter, a set hammer, a cone mandrel of 40 pounds, a bick iron, a monkey tool, 4 punches, a heading tool, a set of taps and dies in a wooden box, a swage block of 190 pounds that she could not afford the freight on, and sold, weeping, to a smith in Dresden for $9. A brace of files, a pair of calipers and a 2-foot rule, a leather apron with a scorch mark on it in the shape of the state of Indiana, and a bundle of her father's stock patterns wired together, which were about as valuable to anybody else as a bundle of sticks. She sold everything else, including her mother's clock. She came out of the settlement with $206 and a freight bill she had not paid yet. And then, in the middle of March, in a boarding house in Zanesville with her father 5 weeks dead and the shop already relettered on the window by another man, she answered an advertisement in a farm weekly. Because she was 27 years old and had no shop and no family and no place, and because a man named Alva Prine in Belle Prairie, Minnesota, had written that he had a half section of the best wheat land in the United States and a good frame house on it, and wanted a wife who was not afraid of work and did not care to live near a town. They wrote back and forth 5 times in 8 weeks. He was a decent correspondent and a decent man, and she had told him the truth about herself in the second letter, all of it, including the number, because she had learned at 19 that it is cheaper to be refused by post than at a depot. And he had written back that he had been raised by a big woman and thought nothing of it, and that what he wanted was somebody to talk to in February. She had sent the freight ahead of her, because the Anvil had to go by slow freight, and she had wanted it there when she was. She had paid $9.40 to send 212 pounds of iron to a place she had never seen, and she had done it 2 days before he wrote the letter that never reached her, and there is no reason at all to think worse of Alva Prine than that. The valley went under in the spring of 1882 the way it did 4 or 5 times in its history. Wheat had gone to 88 cents, and the men who had broken 300 acres on a note had found out what a note is. He was one of 19 men in that county who lost their land at the courthouse door that April. He did write her twice. Both letters came back to Zanesville, addressee removed, and sat in a dead letter office in St. Paul for 11 months. So she was in Belle Prairie, and the Anvil was in Belle Prairie, and the Anvil was the reason she did not get on the eastbound train. She sat in Orpha Dowd's back room on the first night and did the arithmetic on a sheet of paper. $8.80. Board at $3 a week. Fare back to Zanesville, $31 and some. Freight on 212 pounds of iron and the rest of the tools going east again, another 9 or 10. And nothing at the far end of it but a town where everybody knew her and a shop with another man's name on the window. She wrote at the bottom of the sheet, in pencil, the sentence that Orpha Dowd found on the floor under the washstand 3 weeks later and kept, and which is in the county museum now behind glass, along with other things that will come into this story later. It said, "I have a trade, and there is one shop in this town." The next morning she got up at 5 out of habit, ate what Mrs. Dowd put in front of her, and walked down to look at the one shop in that town. Burns' shop stood on the corner of Front Street and the alley, a frame building 30 by 40 with a shingle roof and a wide double door that stood open from April to November, and a shoeing floor of 2-inch plank in front of it, worn into hollows, and a rack of wagon tires leaning against the south wall. She stood across the street for a good while before she went in, and what she was doing over there was reading the shop, which is a thing tradesmen do and everybody else thinks is loitering. She read the coal pile, which was Iowa block coal and not the caking coal you want for welding, and there was a lot of it, which meant the railroad brought it, and it was not dear. She read the pile of scrap by the door, which was mostly broken castings, which is not scrap. That is refuse. A shop that welds has a pile of short rot ends and stub bars and old wagon tire, and it is the most valuable pile on the lot. She read the tire bender and the drill press, both good, both new. She read the chimney, which smoked wrong. And she read the ring of the hammer coming out the door, and the ring told her the most because a smith's rhythm is as particular as a voice. And what she heard was a good, clean, fast rhythm on light work. One man. No striker on the anvil at that hour, a lot of hammer on a lot of small pieces. Then she crossed the street and went in. There were 4 men on the benches by the door, and 1 man at the fire, and Ansel Byrne was setting a shoe on a bay mare with his back to the door and the hoof between his knees. And the 4 men saw her before he did, and one of them made a noise. She waited until he had driven the nail he was on and looked up. "Mr. Byrne," she said. "My name is Almira Stauffer. I'm a smith. I've come out from Zanesville, Ohio, and I'm looking for work at the fire, and I'll take striker's wages to start and prove myself to you before I ask for anything better." That is exactly what she said. 3 of the 4 men on the bench told it the same way afterward, for the rest of their lives, and it is a small thing, but it is worth noticing that she did not say she could cook, and she did not say she was in trouble, and she did not ask for charity. She stated a trade and named a wage. Ansel Byrne put the mare's foot down. He straightened up and took his time doing it. He looked at her for what one of the men on the bench, Hollis Taygarden, said afterward was an unnecessarily long while. Up and down, the whole of her, twice, in front of an audience, and everybody in that shop knew exactly what he was doing, and so did she. Then he said, "You'd found her my floor." That was the line. That is the line that went around Belle Prairie inside of 2 hours and was still being repeated at the elevator in October, and it got a laugh out of the bench that Ansel Byrne enjoyed a great deal. She did not move. "I asked you about work," she said. "I've got no work for a woman. I'm not asking you as a woman, I'm asking you as a striker. You are shoeing shop with no striker and no welding fire, and you've got a rack of 11 wagon tires out there that have been leaning against that wall long enough to rust a stripe into the siding, and it's the 23rd of May. Now that was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake before the end of the sentence. She had been in shops her whole life, and she knew perfectly well what happens when you tell a proud tradesman his own business in front of 4 men on a bench. And she said afterward that she had been 40 hours without proper sleep and had let her mouth get out ahead of her, and that she paid for it for 4 months. The bench went absolutely quiet. Ansel Byrne set the hammer down on the anvil, which is a thing a smith does slowly when he wants you to watch him do it. "Get out of my shop," he said. She went. She had her hand on the doorframe when he said the rest of it, loud to the bench and not to her. He said, "They'll send you anything out here. Anything at all. Send off to Ohio for a wife, and they ship you the whole works, iron and all." She kept walking. Behind her the shop laughed, and the laugh followed her 30 feet up Front Street the way it does in a small town where the buildings are close together and the windows are open in May. Here is a thing that ought to be said before we go on, because there is a version of this story where Ansel Byrne is simply a brute, and that version is easier and worse. He was frightened, not of a woman, of the sentence about the fire. Because Ansel Byrne had known for 11 years that he could not weld, and he had built a whole life on top of that hole in the floor, and he had never once in Belle Prairie met a person who could see it. And a stranger had stood in his door for 90 seconds with her carpet bag still at Mrs. Dowd's, and had looked at his scrap pile and his chimney and said the word out loud in front of Hollis Teagarden. Everything he did to her for the next 4 months came out of that 1 minute. Not because she was fat. That was just the stick that was lying there. She walked back to the boarding house and sat down on the porch steps, which took some doing. And Orpha Dowd came out and stood behind her with her arms folded and said, he said no. He said I'd found her his floor. Orpha Dowd made her short noise. Then she said, "I've buried 2 husbands, and I've kept this house 9 years, and I'll tell you what I know about this town in 1 sentence, and then I'll go and put the beans on. There is not one thing in Belle Prairie that anybody needs that they can get anywhere else. Not one. That's why it's here." And she went in. Almira Stauffer sat on the step until the noon whistle went at the elevator, and what she was doing was thinking about the rack of 11 wagon tires. Now she needed money before she needed anything else. And this is the part of the story that people leave out when they tell it, so it will not be left out here. For 3 weeks and 4 days, Almira Stauffer did the work that was available to a woman with no character reference in a wheat town, and the work that was available was washing. She washed for the section house, which was 7 railroad men, and for the hotel, which was Sheets. And she took it because Orpha Dowd got it for her on the second morning by walking down to the section boss and standing in front of his desk. It paid 60 cents a day, and it was, in the physical sense, harder than smithing. It is bending and wringing and lifting wet, which is the worst kind of lifting there is over a fire in June. And she had bad knees already at 27 from a lifetime of standing on plank. She did it for 25 days. She paid her board every week, and she did not touch the $10 from Alva Prine's note, which she had put in the bottom of the carpet bag inside the ledger and would not spend, and by the 14th of June she had, in a tobacco tin, $16.40, which included the $8.80 she had started with. And in the evenings, after supper, she walked. She walked the whole town in the long light every evening, and she looked at things, and what she was looking at was broken iron. This is the habit of the trade, and she could not have stopped it if she had wanted to. She looked at every wagon standing on Front Street, and at every plow leaning against a storefront, and at every pump in every yard. She counted. She kept it in the ledger, in pencil, in a hand that got smaller as the pages went on, and that ledger is the reason we know as much as we do about Belle Prairie in the summer of 1882, because a county historical society got hold of it in 1938, and a graduate student made a study of it in 1961. What the ledger says is this: in the last 2 weeks of June, 1882, walking out from the middle of one wheat town, Almira Stouffer counted and wrote down 41 wagons with at least one loose tire, which in that country meant a wheel that would dish and go to pieces in the hauling season. 26 broken singletrees mended with wire or a nailed board, 11 pump rods spliced with a bolted fish plate, all 11 leaking or bent. 19 plows with shares worn past the point where they would scour, and in that black clay a share that will not scour is a plow that will not plow. 7 hay rakes with teeth gone. 4 binders standing in sheds with something broken in them that had been standing since last August. 2 windmill pump poles wired. 1 church bell yoke split. And, on the 8th of July, 1 bridge. Beside the count, on the last page of the June entries, she wrote a single line of her father's in German, which Prather the lawyer would have recognized because Caspar Stauffer said it to him about twice a year over the shop stove, and which translates roughly as, "Nobody sends for the smith until the ox is in the ditch, so live near a ditch." She had found her ditch. Now she needed a fire. And that is where Tobias Rask comes into it, and he comes into it in the least romantic way imaginable, which is that he had a stump. He was 34 years old, a Dane out of Schleswig by way of Wisconsin, and he farmed 640 acres 11 miles northwest of town with his older brother's help in season, and he owned in partnership with 10 other men. The only threshing outfit within a 9-mile ring of Belle Prairie, a Minnesota Chief separator, second-hand, bought in 1880, and a portable steam engine on wheels that had to be dragged from farm to farm by 6 horses because it could not move itself. He was tall and heavy in the shoulders and light on his feet the way big Danes sometimes are, with close-cropped sandy hair and a short reddish beard and a face burned dark to the hatline and white above it, and he was known in that county for 2 things. He was slow to talk, which people took for slow to think for about the first year they knew him. And he read machinery catalogs the way other men read the Bible, front to back, over and over, including the parts lists, which he could recite. He had been on the platform on the 22nd of May. He had not laughed. That is not made up to make him look good. 3 separate people mentioned it afterward, because in a crowd of 60 that is laughing, the ones who are not laughing are visible. What he had done on the 22nd of May was look at the crate. He had heard the whump. He had watched the hand truck go over, and he had watched 2 grown men fail to move that crate, and then he had heard a woman's voice explain, before she was even off the step, that the horn of the anvil inside it would chip the platform if they stood it on end, and Tobias Rask, who owned an 11-man share of a machine that broke something every 4th day, and who had spent the previous August driving 42 miles to Crookston with a bent shaker arm in the back of a buggy, had stood there in the crowd and thought a thought he did not say out loud to anybody for 3 weeks. The thought was, that is a striking anvil, not a shoeing anvil, and somebody has shipped it here on purpose. On the 17th of June he came into Belle Prairie for binder twine and found Almira Stauffer standing in the weeds behind the old Ketchum wagon shop at the south end of Front Street, looking up at the roof of it. The Ketchum shop was a 16 by 24 board building with a dirt floor that a wheelwright named Ketchum had put up in 79 and abandoned in 81 when his wife would not stay in the country. It had a hole in the roof the size of a wagon box where the stovepipe had been, and the shingles had gone around it, 1 wall out of plumb, a door hanging on 1 hinge, and 4 years of quack grass growing up through the floor. It belonged to Orpha Dowd, who had taken it in 81 against a board bill and considered it the worst investment of her life. Almira had rented it that morning for $1 a month, with the first 3 months forgiven if she got the roof on before rain. Tobias Rask stopped his wagon in the alley and looked at her looking at the roof, and after a while he said, in the flat, careful English of a man who thinks in another language first, "You will want the door on the north." He turned around. "Why the north?" "Because your light comes in and your fire does not blow back at you," he said. "In this country the wind is northwest 9 months. And if you put the door on the west, the snow will close you in January, and you will not get a horse in until March." She looked at the building for a second. Then she said, "That's right, and I hadn't got that far." "Thank you." And he said, "I have a stump." That is not a joke, and it is not a country saying. That is a sentence that changed both their lives, and it needs about 200 words of explanation. An anvil has to stand on something, and what it stands on determines whether the shop is any good. It cannot stand on a bench, because the blow will go into the bench and rack it apart in a month. It cannot stand on stone, because stone is dead and gives nothing back and will crack. What an anvil wants is a section of a big hardwood log, standing on end, grain up, set into the ground 3 or 4 feet deep and tamped so that the whole earth is under it. Then the anvil is bedded onto the end grain and strapped down, and when you strike, the blow goes into the work, and only the work, and comes back up into your hand as a live ring instead of a dead thud, and the difference between those two things over a 10-hour day is the difference between a smith who is tired and a smith who cannot lift her arms. In the Red River Valley of the North in 1882, there were no trees. There was box elder along the river, which is soft and worthless, and willow, which is worse. A hardwood log of that size, oak or elm, 22 inches through and 5 feet long, was an object that had to be freighted from Wisconsin or Minneapolis, and it cost more than the anvil. Tobias Rask had one. It was a piece of white elm he had hauled up from Sauk Center 4 years before to make a chopping block and a couple of wagon hubs out of, and it had sat behind his granary ever since, with the bark falling off it, and it was, by June of 1882, seasoned right through and hard as a bank safe. He brought it in on the 20th. It took him and his brother and a block and tackle and a plank ramp to get it off the wagon, and it took 4 hours, and it was, by the standards of the neighborhood, an extremely peculiar thing to do for a woman you had not been introduced to. She dug the hole herself. That is in the ledger too, 3 days, because the black clay of that valley digs like cold butter for 2 feet and then like fired brick. And she went down 42 inches and made the bottom flat and dead level with a plank and her father's level, and they walked the elm block in on rollers and stood it up with the tackle over a tripod of 3 telegraph poles the section boss let her borrow. And she tamped it in 6-inch lifts with the butt end of a fence post, 200 and some blows to a lift, and it did not move again for 47 years. Then she built the forge. She had no forge. A shop forge in 1882 was either a brick hearth or a cast iron pan on legs from a catalog, and the catalog one cost $22 delivered, and she had, on the 20th of June, $11.90. So she built the kind her father had learned on in the Palatinate, which is the kind that has been built in every poor country on earth since iron began, and which is better than the catalog one for heavy work anyway. She built a table forge out of the clay under her feet. She drove 4 corner posts of scrap 2 by 4, framed a box on top of them at the height of her own hip bone, which for a smith is the only correct height and is different for everybody, and lined the box with plank, and filled it with the black clay of the Red River Valley wetted and rammed solid in layers 6 inches deep, and hollowed a dish in the middle of it. In the bottom of the dish she set a tire, which is the iron nozzle the air comes through, and she did not have one, so she made one, out of a 2-inch section of well casing and a piece of boilerplate off the refuse pile, welded, with a water leg made from a lard pail so the nozzle would not burn out. It took her a day and a half, and it was the first work she did in Belle Prairie, and it was done in a borrowed corner of the livery with a fire in a wheelbarrow, because she had no forge yet, which is the sort of circular problem the trade is full of, and which every smith solves the same way, by building the first fire in a hole in the ground. For the blast, she needed a bellows. A great double-chambered leather bellows cost $18 new. What she found, after asking at 4 places, was the wreck of one hanging in the loft of the livery barn that had come out of a shop in Fergus Falls, with the leather split along both sides and the board sprung and mice in the top chamber. She bought it for $1. She took it apart on the grass behind the Ketchum shop over 2 evenings, cleaned the boards, planed the sprung one flat with a borrowed jack plane, made a new valve leather out of an old boot top, and re-leathered the whole thing with a cowhide she got from the butcher for 40 cents, because it had a brand burn in it and was no good for harness. She sewed that hide with a harness awl and waxed linen thread, 700 and some stitches, 4 evenings. Sitting on Orpha Dowd's porch, with the lamp out on the rail and the mosquitoes coming off the slough, and Orpha Dowd sat with her and shelled beans and told her about the town. That is where she learned it. Incidentally, 4 evenings of Orpha Dowd is worth 2 years of living in a place. She learned who held paper on whom. She learned that the Belle Prairie Bank had lent on 11,000 acres of that township, and that the bank's man in St. Paul had written twice that spring about it. She learned that Ansel Burns' shop cleared something like $1,900 a year, and that he had $2,000 in the bank and had been talked of for the legislature. She learned that Byrne had a nephew, Roof Byrne, 19, who struck for him when there was heavy work, and who was not a bad boy, but was his uncle's dog. And she learned about the threshing ring, the chimney she made out of a stovepipe run up through the old hole in the roof with a hood of scrap sheet iron over the fire, hung on wire 6 inches above the coals, which is a poor chimney, and smoked for a week until she raised the hood 1.5 inches, and then never smoked again. She set the leg vise on a post. She built a rack for iron out of 4 2x4s. She made a slack tub out of a half barrel and set it on the anvil's left, at the exact distance her father had kept his, which she measured off with her own arm without thinking about it. She scythed the quack grass. She patched the roof with shingles she made herself out of a busted packing crate and a hatchet, and Tobias Rask's brother came in and helped her put the door on the north side, and she paid him with a mended hay knife. And on the 2nd of July, 1882, at 4 in the afternoon, Almira Stauffer lit a fire in Belle Prairie for the first time. She had no welding coal. This became the whole problem of July, and it is worth understanding. There are 2 kinds of coal in a blacksmith's world. There is coal that burns, and there is coal that cakes. What a smith wants is a soft bituminous coal, low in sulfur and low in ash, that softens and sticks together over the fire and forms a hollow crust called a coke oven, under which the iron sits in a still, clean, oxygen-starved heat, and it is only under that crust that a heavy weld is possible at all. Iowa block coal, which was what the railroad brought to Belle Prairie because it was cheap and burned all right in a house stove, is high in sulfur, and sulfur gets into hot iron and makes it red short, which means it crumbles under the hammer at exactly the temperature you need it whole. You can shoe a horse with it. You cannot weld with it. The nearest good welding coal was Illinois coal, sold at the hardware in 100-pound sacks for house forges and threshing engines, and there was, in the whole town, one supplier of it. She went to the hardware on the 3rd of July with $3 and asked for 2 sacks. The clerk, a young man named Pardee, went white and said he would have to ask Mr. Sturgis, and Mr. Sturgis came out from behind the ledger desk and would not look at her and said that they were sold out of that grade and did not expect any. The sacks were stacked 11 high against the wall behind him. She could see them from where she stood. She said, "I can see them, Miss Sturgis," he said. "We're sold out." She stood there for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you," and went out. And she stood on the plank sidewalk in the July sun and understood completely and all at once what she was actually up against, which was not one man's temper. Ansel Byrne had 11 years and $2,000 and every account in that town, and he had been in the hardware, and he would be in every other place too. She did not go back and argue. This is one of the things about her that comes up over and over in every account. She almost never argued with a closed door. She went around it, and she went around it the same day. She walked out of the hardware and down to the depot and asked the station agent, whose name was Emil Wold, and who had been civil to her on the day she arrived, what it would cost to bring in 1 ton of Illinois lump coal consigned to herself from the yard at Fergus Falls. $6.25, freight and all, he said. And he had to look it up, and while he was looking it up, he said, without raising his head, that a person consigning freight to herself was buying at wholesale, and was nobody's business but her own, and that the Manitoba Road did not ask a shipper's sex. She did not have $6.25 free. She had, after the bellows and the hide and the door hinges, $4.10 and a week's board due. So for 3 weeks, from the 3rd of July to the 24th, Almira Stauffer burned charcoal, and she made it herself. This is the part of the story that the county remembered longest and told worst, because from a distance it looked like witchcraft. Charcoal is wood that has been burned in the absence of enough air to let it burn away. You stack the wood, you cover the stack with sod and earth so that it can smolder but not flame, you leave a few vents low down and one at the top, and then you tend it for 2 or 3 days and nights, opening a vent here and stopping one there, reading the color of the smoke, because if you let too much air in you will have a heap of ashes in the morning, and if you let too little in the fire will die, and you will have a pile of wet sticks. When the smoke goes from white to thin blue, you close everything and let it cool for a day, and then you rake out charcoal, which is nearly pure carbon, which burns hotter and cleaner than any coal on earth and has no sulfur in it at all, and which every smith before 1800 used, and which is still the best welding fuel there is if you have enough of it. The trouble with it is that it takes about 7 pounds of wood to make 1 pound of charcoal, and it goes up the chimney like paper, and a working forge will eat a bushel of it in 90 minutes. There was no wood in Belle Prairie except what was in the buildings, but 3 miles east, along the Sand Hill River, there were box elder and willow and a good deal of dead standing ash and elm out of the flood of '79, and nobody wanted any of it, because it was too soft for lumber and too far out for stove wood when the railroad was bringing coal in at $4 a ton. She hired Gustave Lem, the 16-year-old from the livery who had handed her Alva Prine's note and had felt bad about it ever since, at 20 cents a day and his dinner. And for 11 days in the first half of July, the two of them cut and hauled dead wood out of the river bottom in a borrowed wagon, and she built 2 earth kilns on the flat behind the Ketchum shop and burned them. She sat up with the first one for 2 nights. Orpha Dowd brought a chair out at 10 o'clock the first night and set it down beside her without a word and went back to bed, and Almira sat in it in the dark in the middle of a town that was laughing at her, with a lantern and a rake and a pail of water, and watched the color of smoke coming out of a mound of dirt. It gave her, she wrote in the ledger, 11 bushels the first burn and 19 the second, and it cost her $2.20 in wages and 11 days, and it was, at the price of the alternative, cheap. And here is what the town saw. The town saw the fat woman from Ohio, who had been sent for by a bankrupt and abandoned on a platform, squatting out behind a derelict wagon shop at midnight beside a smoking heap of dirt. Alone, it went through Belle Prairie the way that kind of thing does. There was a version in which she was burning her furniture. There was a version in which she was cooking something. There was a very popular version, which the Belle Prairie Clarion printed as a 2-line joke in the local column on the 13th of July, that the town's new mechanic had gone into the business of manufacturing smoke, and that at least there was no shortage of raw material. And on the evening of the 10th of July, 4 young men who had been drinking came out from town and stood off in the dark and hooted for a while, and one of them threw a bottle, and Almira Stauffer stood up out of her chair with a rake in her hand and did not say one word, and just stood and let them see the whole size of her against the glow, and they went away. And she sat back down and cried for a bit, and then went on watching the smoke. She told that story herself in 1922 to a woman from the State Historical Society who came out with a notebook, and the Historical Society woman wrote, in her own hand, in the margin, She said this without any bitterness at all, and it took me some minutes to understand that she thought it was a funny story. The first paying work came on the 9th of July, and it was a stove lid lifter. A Norwegian woman named Merit Hieli, who lived over the bakery and had heard about the shop from Orfa Dowd, came down the alley with a broken lid lifter in her apron and asked, in about 9 words of English, whether it could be made. Almira took it, looked at it, made a new one out of a piece of 1/2 inch round in 11 minutes with a scarf and a twist for the handle, better than the one that broke, and charged her 10 cents. Maratiel came back on the 11th with 2 neighbors and a bent poker and a hoe with a broken eye. The hoe with the broken eye is the one that mattered, though nobody knew it at the time, because to fix a hoe with a broken eye you have to weld, and Maratiel stood in the door of that shop with her arms folded and watched a woman weld iron, and what she saw she described to 11 people that week in Norwegian, and by the following Sunday there was not a Norwegian farm wife in that township who had not heard that the fat American woman at the south end of Front Street could stick iron together with fire. Now it is time to say what a fire weld is, because the whole rest of this story stands on it, and most people have never had it explained. You cannot glue iron. You cannot solder anything that has to take a load. Before there was such a thing as an electric arc or a torch, which in 1882 there was not, there was exactly one way to make 2 pieces of iron into 1 piece of iron, and that was to bring both pieces up to a temperature just short of the temperature at which iron burns, and to put them together at that temperature and strike them, and the 2 surfaces would, if everything was right, become one metal with no seam in it, stronger than the parent bar. Everything has to be right, and there are about 9 things. The ends have to be prepared. You do not butt 2 square ends together. You upset each end first, which means you heat it and drive it back on itself to make it thicker so the weld will have meat in it, and then you scarf them, which means you draw each end to a shallow rounded wedge with a slight crown on the face, so that when they are laid together the middle touches first and the air is squeezed out to the edges. If the faces are flat, air stays in the middle, and you get what is called a cold shut, which is a weld that looks perfect and is a crack. The fire has to be right, deep, clean, coked over, no clinker in the bottom, no green coal on top, a hollow of still incandescent carbon with no air coming through it except through the tire. The iron has to be clean, and it will not stay clean, because at those temperatures the surface makes scale as fast as you can look at it. So you flux, which is to say you throw borax or clean silica sand on the hot scarf, and it melts and floats and makes a glass that keeps the air off and that squirts out sideways when you strike. And then there is the heat itself, and this is the part that cannot be taught out of a book and that took Almira Stauffer 4 years at her father's elbow to learn. Welding heat for wrought iron is a white heat, just under burning, and the window is narrow, too cold and it will not stick. Too hot and the iron burns, throws sparks like a firework, and is ruined, and burnt iron cannot be recovered. It has to be cut off and thrown in the scrap. You know it is right by the color, which is a white that has gone slightly greasy and looks wet, and by the sound of the fire, which changes, and by the sparks, which come in a certain lazy way just before they come in a violent way, and by nothing else. There is no gauge. There has never been a gauge. And then both pieces have to arrive at that condition at the same moment and be pulled out and laid together and struck in about 4 seconds. And the first blows have to be light and fast and dead on the middle, and then heavy, and if you fumble the tongs or your striker is a beat slow, the heat is gone, and you put it back and start again, and each time you do the iron is a little more burned at the edges, and after 3 or 4 tries, you are done. That is what Ansel Byrne could not do. It is not a shameful thing not to be able to do. It is a thing a great many good tradesmen never learned, and in 1882 it was the exact line between 2 grades of shop. And that was the line Almira Stauffer had been standing on the far side of since she was 13. The second thing she could do, and it came in almost as fast, was lay a plowshare. In a country with no stone, a plowshare does not chip, it wears, and the black clay of the Red River Valley polished a share the way a whetstone polishes a knife. And when a share went round-nosed and thin, it would not scour. And when it would not scour, the clay stuck to it in 50-pound lumps, and the team stalled, and the field stopped. Every farm in that township ran shares down to nothing by August. The manufacturer's answer was to buy a new share at $2.40 apiece, freight from Moline, for every plow bottom every year. The smith's answer, in Ohio and Pennsylvania and everywhere the trade was old, was to lay the share, which is to weld a new piece of steel onto the worn edge and the point, and then to draw it out and shape it to the original curve and harden it so that the share came back better than the factory one and cost 60 cents. Nobody in Belle Prairie had ever had a share laid. There had never been anybody there who could do it. Every worn share in that township for 4 years had gone on the refuse pile behind the machine agency. She laid her first one on the 14th of July for a Norwegian named Ole Brotsberg, who had come with Merit Hiel's brother and who had not really believed it, and she laid 4 more that week, and 11 the week after, and on the 24th of July she paid Emil Wold $6.25 at the depot and consigned herself a ton of Illinois coal from Fergus Falls. And the earth kilns behind the Ketchum shop were never lit again. It is easy to write that as a triumph. It was not yet through all of July and most of August the money came in dimes and quarters. She was still washing at the section house 3 mornings a week into the 1st of August because a share at 60 cents does not pay a $3 board bill fast enough. And meanwhile, the other thing was happening, the thing that came out of Ansel Burn, and it got steadily worse all summer. It started as talk, and the talk was cheap and effective, and it had 3 parts, and each part was aimed at a different audience. To the farmers, he said, she is not a smith, she is a striker, which is a laborer, and a laborer with a hammer will get your machinery wrong, and you will find it out at the worst hour of the year. Which was a shrewd thing to say, because it is exactly what a knowledgeable man would say if it were true, and because the men he said it to could not tell the difference. To the town, he said the other thing, and he said it in the way that men say that kind of thing, which is as a joke on the bench where the ladies could not hear it, and it was always about her body, and it was always the same 3 or 4 jokes, and the town repeated them for 4 months. There was one about the elm block. There was one about the freight scale. There was one about Alva Prine and Idaho that was genuinely cruel and that got repeated more than the others. And to the trade, he did the thing that actually had teeth, which was to close the accounts. Sturgis at the hardware would not sell her coal or bar stock or files. The lumber yard would not sell her shingles the second time she asked. The machine agency, which was a branch house for 2 implement companies and which had a warehouse full of exactly the parts and stock she needed, was told plainly by Byrne, in front of 2 witnesses, that he would move his own trade to Crookston if they supplied the Ketchum shop, and the agency was a young man on salary with a wife and no standing, and he did what he was told. By the middle of August, Almira Stouffer could not buy 1 foot of new iron inside the town of Belle Prairie. She solved that the way she solved the coal, which is to say she went around it and did not mention it to anybody, and the solution was so simple that when the town found out about it in September, it made several men very angry. She bought scrap. Old wagon tire is wrought iron, 1½ by 3/8, hand-rolled, and in that valley in 1882, the good old wrought was better iron than anything the mills were selling new, because it had been worked and worked again. Broken buggy springs are spring steel. Worn-out plowshares are soft center steel, and the steel in them is the best cutting steel that ever came into that county. A busted mower knife is a row of 40 hardened sections. A rusted binder is a Christmas dinner. She put it about, through Merit Shelley and through Gustav Lem and through Orpha Dowd, that she would pay 1/4 cent a pound for any old iron a farm wanted hauled off its yard, and 1/2 cent for old tire and buggy springs, and that the boy would come and get it. and 160 farms in that township, which had been throwing broken iron over the fence into the slot for 4 years because there was no earthly use for it, began sending it in by the wagon load and being paid actual money for what they regarded as garbage. Gustav Lem hauled 2,300 pounds of it in the last 2 weeks of August. She paid $9.11 for it, and it kept that shop in stock until the following June, and it was, per pound, about a fifth of what Ansel Byrne was paying Sturgis for new bar across the street. The scrap pile behind the Ketchum shop got to be a landmark. People used to walk their visitors down to look at it. By the last week of August, she had, on her books, 61 names. The Norwegian and Swedish farms first, almost all of them, because Merit Hieli had seen the hoe, and because those farms were the poorest in the township, and 60 cents against $2.40 is not a preference, it is a decision. Then Ole Bratsberg's cousins, then the whole of the settlement north of the section line, then, one at a time and quietly, and mostly after dark for the first month, the Yankee farms. The first American who came to her in daylight and hitched in front where everybody could see it was Tobias Rask, on the 2nd of August, with a broken drawbar off the separator, and there is no doubt in anybody's account that he did it deliberately and at noon. She welded it while he watched. It took her 35 minutes, including the fire. He watched the whole thing without saying one word, and he watched it the way a man watches who knows what he is looking at, which she noticed. At the end of it, he picked up the drawbar and turned it over twice and found the weld with his thumb, which you can only just do. And then he asked her a question that nobody else in Belle Prairie asked her all summer, which was, "What can you not do?" She laughed. Then she gave him a straight answer, because he had asked straight. "I cannot shoe a horse as well as Byrne can," she said. "I can shoe. My father shod. But he has hands for a horse, and I have not got them, and I am not going to pretend I have. Because a man will forgive a bad weld, and he will never forgive a lame team. I cannot do fine work in brass. I cannot cast. And there is nothing in this shop, or any shop in this state, that will mend a broken casting properly, whatever anybody tells you, though I can strap one so it will run. And I cannot lift what I could at 22, and my knees are gone, and in 10 years I will need a boy." Tobias Rask nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. Then he said, "Our engine has a crown sheet stay that weeps." And that was the whole of the courtship for the next 3 months. The bridge came on the 24th of August. Belle Prairie's bridge was 2 miles east of town, where the county road crossed the Sandhill River. And it was a queen post timber bridge of a single 72-foot span, built by the county in 1879, with 2 great iron tension rods running down from the posts to the bottom cord, and a set of vertical hanger rods with upset ends and forged eyes. She had looked at it on the 8th of July on one of her evening walks, and she had written in the ledger, "Bridge, east. Hanger rod second from north end. Upset end shows a crack at the shoulder. Will fail." She had told the county road overseer, a man named Chauncey Pratt, on the 10th of July, standing in the door of the elevator office with her kerchief in her hand. He had thanked her, and told the story that afternoon on Byrne's bench, and Ansel Byrne had said that the woman had now taken to inspecting bridges. And there had been a great deal of laughing, and Chauncey Pratt, who was not a bad man, but was a man who did not care to be laughed at twice, had not gone out to look at it. On the 24th of August, at about 4:30 in the afternoon, a load of wheat went over that bridge, and the second hanger rod from the north end let go at the shoulder with a bang that was heard at the elevator 2 miles off, and the bottom cord dropped 11 inches on that side, and the wagon went down at a slant and lodged, and the horses went to their knees and were got out. And nobody was killed, and the bridge was shut. That would have been a nuisance and nothing more, except for 2 things. The first is that the Sandhill River was up. There had been 4.5 inches of rain in 8 days in the middle of August, which is a great deal in that country, and the ford below the bridge, which everybody used in a dry year, was running belly deep to a horse and cutting. The second is that the doctor lived on the east side. His name was Dr. Ansley Pomeroy. He was 66 years old and the only physician in 11 miles, and the whole west half of the township, which is to say the town of Belle Prairie and 40 farms, was on the other side of a shut bridge and a bad ford from him. And everybody understood the arithmetic of that inside of about an hour. The county's answer was to write to the bridge company in Minneapolis, and Chauncey Pratt did write, on the 25th. And the reply came on the 31st and said that a replacement hanger rod forged to their pattern could be shipped within 18 days. 18 days, on the 4th of September, in a wheat township, with the harvest cut and shocked, and the threshing about to start, and every wagon in the country needing that road. They tried a splice. 2 men from the elevator, and Chauncey Pratt and a carpenter, bolted a pair of fish plates across the broken shoulder with 4 half-inch bolts and jacked the cord back up. And on the 2nd of September, a load went over, and the fish plate bolts drew through the rod like a knife going into cheese, because the rod was 1 1/8 inch round, and the plates were bearing on 4 little bolt holes drilled through it, and the cord dropped again, further this time, and now the bridge was not merely shut. It was condemned, and on the 3rd of September, Ansel Byrne was asked to make a rod. He took the broken pieces into his shop and had them 3 days. What he did was to make a new rod out of new 1 1/4 inch round bar, which was the right material, and to thread both ends and turn up a pair of clevis fittings for them, because the original had forged eyes and he could not forge an eye. A forged eye on a tension rod, in case it is not obvious, is made by upsetting the end of the bar to make it thick, bending it around the horn of the anvil into a loop, scarfing the 2 faces where they meet, and fire welding the loop closed, so that the eye is one continuous piece of metal with the rod, and there is no place for it to come apart. It is the plainest heavy weld in the trade, and every General Smith in the older states could do it in his sleep, and it is precisely the operation that a farrier's shop never performs. His clevis and thread answer would have worked in a machine shop with a lathe and a die. In a shoeing shop with a hand die, it did not, quite. The thread he cut was shallow at the root, and the rod was a hair undersized where the die had wandered, and there was no shoulder, and any engineer would have told him that he had put the whole tension of a bridge cord into the bottom of a shallow thread, which is the exact place where iron pulls apart. They hung it on the 5th of September and jacked the cord up, and drove a wagon over it, and it held. They drove a second wagon over it on the 6th, and it held. On the 7th of September, a case threshing engine, 7.5 tons on wheels, went over that bridge at a walk, and the new rod parted at the first thread under the nut with a report like a gun, and the northeast corner of the bridge came down 4 feet and stopped on the pier, and the engine stood on the deck at an angle with its water going out of it, while 11 men got chains on it, and the crew got off unhurt, and the bridge was over. That is a real thing that happened in the Red River Valley more than once in those years, and it was the ruin of small counties. Nobody laughed at anybody on the 7th of September. What happened next is the first of the 2 nights that this story exists for. At about 8 in the evening on the 7th, Tobias Rask and his brother Petter and Ole Bratsberg and, of all people, Chauncey Pratt, walked down to the south end of Front Street to a shop that most of them had never been in, and found the door open and the fire banked and Elmira Stouffer sitting on a nail keg with her boots off. And Chauncey Pratt, to his lasting credit, took his hat off and said, "Ma'am, in July you told me that Rod would go, and I laughed at you in front of Ansel Byrne's stove, and I have been ashamed of it since 4 o'clock this afternoon. I have got no authority to hire you. The county board don't meet till the 18th. I am asking you as a man with no money in his hand." She said, "Bring me both pieces of the old rod and the new one and everything you took off it, and don't clean anything." They brought it at 9. She laid the pieces out on the dirt floor of that shop under 2 lanterns, and she went over them for 40 minutes on her knees with a pair of calipers and her thumbnail, and she read them the way you would read a letter. And then she stood up and told 4 men what had happened to their bridge, in order. The original rod, she said, was good iron and a good eye, but it had been made with the upset too short, so the shoulder under the eye was a sharp change of section instead of a swelled taper, and every load that went over that bridge for 3 years had worked that corner. And it had cracked slowly, and she had seen the crack in July, and it was still there. Look, dark, old rust in it. That break is a year old at least. That is not an accident of Tuesday. The new rod, she said, was good bar iron and honest work as far as it went, and it had failed because there was no upset on it at all. He put the tension of the whole cord into the root of a thread that was cut, not rolled, on undersized stock with no shoulder to bear on, and it necked and pulled at the first heavy load exactly where it would. Chauncey Pratt said, "Can you make one that will not?" And Almira Stouffer said the sentence that Peter Rask told his grandchildren, which was, "I can make you 2, and I will make the second one for nothing, and you will hang the second one on the other side, because that rod has been carrying the same load for 3 years as the one that broke, and it is the same age, and it came out of the same shop, and if you hang my rod on the north and leave his on the south, you have not fixed a bridge, you have bought yourself a summer." She made the first rod on the night of the 8th of September, and the second on the night of the 9th, and she made them at night for a reason she gave freely to anybody who asked, which was that a smith judges welding heat by color, and that color is a lie in daylight. In an open shop at noon in September, the difference between a white heat that will weld and a white heat that will burn is invisible, and every old shop in the older states did its heavy welding early in the morning or after dark or in a shed with the shutters closed, and the men who tell you otherwise have never welded anything that mattered. She needed a striker. She did not have one. Tobias Rask offered, and she looked at his hands and his shoulders and said no, and she said why, and the why is the best short explanation of that trade that anybody ever wrote down about her, and Peter Rask remembered it nearly word for word. She said, "I don't want strength. I have got strength. I want a man who will hit the same place 40 times and not think about it once. A strong man who thinks is the worst striker there is, because on the 4th blow he will decide he sees what I am doing and he will help me. And he will move a ½ inch, and I will have to put it back in the fire, and I have got about 11 seconds of iron, and I cannot spend them teaching. Send me somebody who has done it." There was one man in Belle Prairie who had done it, and he was Ansel Byrne's nephew. Rufe Byrne was 19 years old. He was a long-boned, red-eared, sandy young man who had struck for his uncle since he was 15 on the few heavy jobs that shop did, and who had spent the whole summer of 1882 repeating his uncle's jokes on the sidewalk in front of the Clarion office, and who had, on the 10th of July, been one of the 4 young men who came out in the dark and hooted at a woman watching a charcoal kiln, though he had not been the one who threw the bottle. Tobias Rask went and got him at 9:30 at night out of the back room of the Sherman House, and what he said to him is not recorded, and Rufe Byrne came. Almira Stouffer looked at him in the doorway of her shop for a long moment. Then she said, without any edge in it at all, 16 pound, or 10. 16, he said. Take your coat off, she said, and stand there, and when I tap, you hit where I tapped, and when I tap the anvil face twice you stop. Don't talk to me. I will not be talking to you. They worked from 10 at night until 20 minutes past 4 in the morning, and they made a hanger rod 1 1/4 inch round, 6 feet 11 inches long, with a forge welded eye at the top and a proper long upset swelling below it, and a threaded lower end cut on stock that had been upset first so that the root of the thread was on iron that was thicker than the bar, which is the entire difference between a rod that holds a bridge and a rod that is a joke. The eye is worth watching, because this is the moment in the story where a person who has never stood in a shop can see the thing plainly for the first time. She heated 14 inches of the end of that bar to a yellow and upset it, which means she stood the bar on end on the anvil face and drove it down on itself with the 16-pound sledge in Ruth Burns' hands, 40 blows to a heat, 6 heats. And the end of the bar swelled and shortened and thickened from 1 1/4 inch to a fat 2 inches through. Upsetting is the hardest plane work in the trade. It is nothing but blows, hundreds of them on iron, that is trying to bend instead of thicken, and you have to keep it dead straight, and you have to keep it hot only where you want it, cooling the rest with a wet swab. And there is no trick to it, and no way to hurry it, and it is precisely the operation that a shop without a striker will always find a reason to skip. Then she bent the thickened end around the horn into a loop the size of the pin that would go through it, and scarfed the two faces and fluxed them with borax she had carried from Ohio in a tin, and put the loop back in a fire she had been building and coking for 2 hours. And Ruth Burns pumped the bellows on her word. Slow, steady, no gusts. And she stood over that fire with her face 6 inches from the edge of it and did not look at anything else for 4 minutes. Peter Rask and Ole Bratsberg and Chauncey Pratt sat on the scrap pile in the dark and watched through the open door. She said, without turning her head, Hammer, Ruth Burns stood up and took the sledge. She pulled it out. The end of that rod was the color of the inside of a lamp, and it was throwing off a light that put 4 shadows on the wall behind her, and there was a wet look on it like sweat, and 1 or 2 lazy sparks came off it and floated, and Chauncey Pratt said afterward that the whole building smelled like a lightning strike. She laid the loop on the anvil face and hit it once herself with a hand hammer, light, right on the middle of the scarf, and the borax came out sideways in a spray of white fire, and she tapped, and Ruth Burns swung, and the 16-pound sledge came down exactly where she had tapped. He tapped again. He swung again. 11 blows. She turned the work a quarter and tapped the far side, and he came down on the far side 11 more, and then she tapped the anvil face twice, and he stopped with the sledge up. She held the eye up to the lantern and turned it over. Then she said, "All right," and put it in the fire again for a finishing heat, and it was done. There was no seam. There is a photograph of that rod taken in 1954 by a highway department engineer with a hand camera, because a bridge crew had brought it into the county shop, and he thought somebody ought to have a picture of it, and in the photograph you can see the swell of the upset under the eye, and you cannot see the weld at all, and the engineer wrote on the back of it, in pencil, "Hand-forged eye, no visible weld line, believed 1880s, this rod carried the East Bridge till 1929. They worked the second night on the second rod and finished at 2 in the morning because it went faster, and on the 10th of September Ruth Burns did not come to his uncle's shop until 11 o'clock and did not say where he had been. The 2 rods went in on the 12th. It took 4 men, 2 jack screws and most of a day, and at 4 in the afternoon Chauncey Pratt drove a wagon over, and then 2 wagons, and then, because Tobias Rask insisted on it and stood in the middle of the deck while it happened, the same case engine, 7.5 tons, at a walk, all the way across and back. The cord did not move. A man laid a straightage on it, and it did not move a 16th. There were perhaps 60 people at that bridge on the afternoon of the 12th of September, 1882, and Almira Stauffer was not one of them. Because she was at her fire laying a plowshare for Merritt Jell's brother-in-law, and had said that a bridge either holds or it does not, and that standing on it would not change which, and Orpha Dowd, who was there, said that when the engine came off the far end the crowd made a noise, and that she looked around at all of them and thought, "You fools, 3 weeks ago you were laughing about the elm block." Something changed in that town in the week after the 12th of September, and it did not change the way people expect it to. Nobody apologized. Not one person in Belle Prairie ever came down to the Ketchum shop and said, "I was wrong about you in June." That is not how a small place works, and anybody who has lived in one knows it. What happened instead was smaller and better. The jokes stopped. Not all at once, and not from everybody, but the 3 jokes about her body that had been going around Front Street since May went quiet inside of about 10 days. And they went quiet because a joke needs a room to live in, and by the middle of September, there was nobody left in that township who wanted to be the man still telling it. And the second thing that changed was that men began, without any of them noticing they were doing it, to describe her by her trade instead of by her size. The Clarion, which in July had printed a joke about the manufacture of smoke, printed a line on the 21st of September referring to the smith at the south end of Front Street, with no adjective in front of it at all. And Orpha Dowd cut it out with a scissors and put it in the Bible in her front room, and it was still in there when she died. Almira Stauffer, for her part, said nothing about any of it, and worked 11 and 12 hours a day, and on the 16th of September she paid Orpha Dowd 4 weeks' board in advance for the first time in her life, and on the 17th she bought a second pair of boots. The county board met on the 18th and voted her $31 for the 2 rods and the labor, which she had not asked for, having said she would make the second for nothing, and which she took because she had a coal bill. And it was on the 18th of September, in the front room of the Sherman House, that she met Emmett Sturdivant. He was a traveling agent for a threshing machinery house out of Minneapolis, a small, dry, precise man of about 50, with steel spectacles and a linen duster, who covered 11 counties in that valley from August to November, and who had heard the bridge story twice by dinner time. He came down to the Ketchum shop with his hat in his hand and asked whether he might look at a piece of her work. And she gave him a laid share and a mended singletree, and he looked at both for a long time, and then he asked if she had anything welded that he might break. She gave him a test piece off the scrap pile, a 1/2-inch bar with a weld in the middle of it, and he took it out into the alley and put it in the fork of a fence post and pulled on it with a length of pipe until it bent double, and it bent through the weld and did not open. He came back in and stood in the door and said, "Madam, there is not a shop between here and Grand Forks that can do that, and I include the railroad shop." And then he said the useful thing, which is the reason his name is in this story. He said that his house would sell her anything in the catalog at agent's cost, delivered to the depot at Belle Prairie, on his own account, and that she could pay him in November, and that if she wanted bar stock and borax and a set of blacksmith's taps, she should write it on a piece of paper right now while he had his book out. She wrote it. It came on the 29th. And Sturges at the hardware, who found out about it from the freight platform, went and told Ansel Byrne, and Ansel Byrne stood in the middle of his own shop floor and did not say anything for a while, and then he threw a hoof knife into the wall. That was the 18th of September, and it was the top of the summer for her, and it lasted 11 days. Because what happened on the 29th of September was that a hay rack broke in the middle of Front Street with a boy on it. The rack belonged to a farmer named Dolphus Meeker, and it had come in on the 21st with both front hounds cracked and a broken reach iron, and she had welded the reach iron and put new bolts through the hounds. And it had gone out on the 23rd and been used a week. On the 29th, coming down Front Street loaded with the last of the flax straw, the reach iron parted at the weld and the front bolster swung, and the rack went over sideways against the front of the Clarion office, and Dolphus Meeker went off the top of the load into the street and got up, and his son, who was 12, went off the other side and under the load, and they got him out in about a minute and a half, and he had a broken collarbone and a broken arm above the elbow and a great deal of blood from a scalp cut, and for about 20 minutes on Front Street, it was believed that he was dying. Dr. Pomeroy came over the new bridge in 11 minutes and set the arm on the counter of the Clarion office, and the boy lived and grew up and ran a garage in that town until 1941. But at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 29th of September, 1882, the broken reach iron was lying in the middle of Front Street with the weld open in it, bright and clean and unmistakable, and there were 40 people standing around it, and Ansel Byrne walked down from his shop in his apron and picked it up and held it above his head and turned around with it slowly so that everybody could see, and said, in a voice that carried the length of the street, "There, that is what a striker's weld looks like on the inside." I have been saying it since May. I have been laughed at for saying it. There is a boy in that building with his arm broke, and I want every man here to look at this and remember I said it in May. It was, from where he stood, absolutely honest. He believed it entirely. And it was the worst thing that ever happened to Almira Stauffer, worse than the platform, worse than Alva Prine, because on the platform they had laughed at her body, and on Front Street they were looking at her work. She came up the street. Somebody said, "Here she is," and the crowd opened. She took the reach iron out of Ansel Burns' hands. He let her have it. He wanted her to have it. She turned it over twice and looked at the broken face of the weld in the daylight. And then she carried it 15 feet to the shade of the awning in front of Sturgis's Hardware and turned it in the shade, and everybody watched her do it, and nobody understood why. And then she stood very still for about 4 seconds. Then she said to Dolphus Meeker, and not to anybody else, "How is he?" Meeker said, "Arms broke. Pomeroy's got him." She said, "I will pay the doctor and I will pay for the rack, and I am not saying that because of what has been said in the street." And then she walked back down to her shop with the reach iron in her hand and shut the door, which she had never once done in daylight since the 2nd of July. Here is what she had seen in the shade. The broken face of that weld was not a cold shut. A cold shut is gray and smooth and dead in the middle, where the two faces never joined, and it looks like a crack, because it is one. That face was not smooth. It was a mass of fine crystals, coarse-grained, and around the outside of it there was a rim about 1/16 of an inch wide that was black and slaggy and looked exactly like burnt bread. And in the shade you could see a dull sheen on it like tarnish on a spoon. That is red short iron. That is what happens when sulfur gets into wrought iron at welding heat. It does not fail to stick. It sticks, and then it crumbles, because the sulfur has got in along the grain boundaries and made the metal rotten hot, and a weld made in a sulfur fire will look perfect coming off the anvil, will file bright, will ring true, and will come apart under load a week later. She had welded that reach iron with Illinois coal out of her own bin in a fire she had built herself. She spent the afternoon of the 29th alone, with the door shut, doing what she had been trained to do, which was to find out. She took her fire apart. She raked out the whole hearth onto a sheet of iron and went through it with a rake and her hands. And she found, in the clinker at the bottom of that fire, 4 pieces of what she was looking for, and there is no possibility of mistake about it. 4 fist-sized lumps of soft yellow-gray rock with the crumbly bright grain of iron pyrites, which is the mineral the trade calls sulfur balls or brasses, which occurs naturally in coal seams, which every coal dealer in the country picks out by hand before selling to smiths, and which one lump of in the bottom of a fire will spoil every weld made over it for a day. 4 lumps do not get into a coal bin by accident. She went out to the coal bin and dug it over with a shovel, all of it, 1 barrow at a time, in the yard, on her knees, until dark, and she found 11 more pieces. And they were not scattered through the ton the way natural inclusions would be. They were in the top 18 inches, and they were in the corner nearest the door. She knew who by 10 o'clock that night, and it was not a guess, it was the shape of the thing. It had to be somebody who knew what sulfur does to a weld. And there were exactly 2 people within 11 miles who knew that, and one of them was her. She did not go to the sheriff. She could not have proved 1 word of it, and she knew it. And a woman in Belle Prairie in 1882 accusing Ansel Byrne of anything at all in front of a justice of the peace would have finished her. And she knew that too. What she did instead is why people in that county still tell this story. She got up on the 30th of September and opened her door at 6 as usual, and she wrote out a notice in her own hand on a piece of wrapping paper and nailed it to the doorpost, and what it said was this: "Every piece of work that has left this shop since the 2nd of July, bring it back. I will look at it. If it is bad, I will make it new, and there is no charge, and I do not care whose fault it was. Bring it in whatever condition. I will be here at 6 in the morning and at 9 at night." And then she stood in that door for 11 days and made good on it. 61 names had come to that shop in the summer. 40 of them came back in the first week, most of them with nothing wrong at all, some of them with a chip on their shoulder, 4 of them, she said afterward, in the hope of getting something for nothing, and she took all of it without a word. She found 11 bad welds. Every single one of them was dated between the 20th and the 28th of September, which is exactly the period she expected, because she had opened a fresh corner of the bin on the 19th. She made all 11 again. She worked in those 11 days an average of 19 hours, and she did the fresh work of a threshing season on top of it, because it was the first week of October and the whole valley was in a hurry, and at the end of it she had $11 less than she started with and had gone through a quarter ton of coal for nothing. And here is the thing that neither Ansel Byrne nor anybody in Belle Prairie expected, and that Almira Stauffer, who was not a clever woman about people in any other way, understood perfectly, because she had grown up in a shop on a canal bank in a town full of tradesmen. A farmer does not judge a mechanic by whether his work fails. All work fails. A farmer judges a mechanic by what he does about it. Ansel Byrne, in 11 years in Belle Prairie, had never once taken a piece of his own work back. He had never had to. He was the only shop. When a thing he had done came apart, and things did, the answer had always been that the iron was poor, or the man had abused it, or that the factory part was no good. And there was nowhere else for anybody to go, and so it was always somebody else's fault, and everybody had got used to it. 40 men brought their iron back to the south end of Front Street in the first week of October, expecting an argument, having heard from Ansel Byrne on Monday exactly what they should expect, and every single one of them got the same thing instead. A woman with gray circles under her eyes taking the piece out of his hands and looking at it in the shade and saying either, "That is sound. Take it home," or, "That is mine. Leave it. Come Thursday." By the 8th of October, the story going around that township was not that the fat woman's welds break. The story was what she nailed to her door. She never told a living soul about the sulfur balls until 1922. She kept them. All 15 pieces went into a tobacco tin with a label in her hand on the lid. And the tin sat on the window ledge of that shop for 47 years where anybody could have picked it up and nobody ever asked, and it is in the county museum now next to the piece of paper that says, "I have a trade and there is one shop in this town." She told the woman from the Historical Society at 67 years old why she had said nothing at the time. She said, "I had one thing to sell in that town, and it was that my work is good. If I had stood in the street and said somebody put sulfur in my coal, then for the rest of my life every weld of mine that ever broke would have had a story attached to it, and I would have been a woman with an excuse." A shop cannot live on excuses. It was cheaper to make 11 welds again, and then she said the other half of it, which the Historical Society woman underlined twice, besides which, "The boy's arm was broke, and it was broke with my iron, whoever salted my fire. There is no getting around who let the piece out the door." Now, all of that, the bridge and the boy and the 11 days, was happening against a background, and it is time to bring the background forward, because from the second week of October, it is the only thing anybody in that valley was thinking about: the wheat. The crop of 1882 in the Red River Valley was the largest crop that country had ever grown. It came in on a wet spring and a hot July, and it stood 5 feet high, and it went 31 and 34, and in places 38 bushels to the acre on land that had gone 20 in a normal year, and every man who had put in a big acreage on borrowed money looked at it in August and did the arithmetic and could not sleep. And here is the trap that a big crop sets, and the valley walked into it with its eyes open every 4 or 5 years. Wheat has to be cut ripe, and it is cut with a binder into bundles and stood up in shocks in the field, and there it stays. in the weather until a threshing machine gets to it. The grain is not grain until it is threshed. Standing in the shock, it is a bet against rain and frost and wind, and every week it stands the bet gets worse, because rain in the shock sprouts it, and sprouted wheat grades as feed, and is worth about half, and a hard wind lays the shocks down, and then rain gets in from underneath, and you lose the bottom third of every one. A township can cut its crop in 9 days. It cannot thresh it in 9 days. Threshing was done by outfits, and there were not many outfits, and one outfit could put through perhaps 800 to 1,200 bushels in a long day if nothing broke and the men held out. Belle Prairie Township had 11 farms in the Rask Ring, and those 11 farms had, in shock, in October of 1882, a little better than 14,000 bushels of hard red spring wheat. At 80 cents, that is $11,200. There were, against those 11 farms, mortgage and machinery notes falling due between the 1st of November and the 15th of December totaling, as near as the bank's records let anybody figure it afterward, $6,100 and some dollars. There was no second outfit. The nearest was at Grandin, 22 miles, contracted solid into November. There was no such thing as trucking wheat somewhere else. And there is a date in that country that everybody knows in their bones, which is that the ground freezes hard, on the average, in the 3rd week of October, and after the freeze a steam engine on wheels with 6 horses on the pole cannot be moved across a plowed field without wrecking it or itself, and the shocks go under the first real snow. And whatever is not threshed by then is threshed in March out of a wet stack, at a loss, if at all. They started on the 2nd of October at Ole Bratsburg's, and they were running well. They were putting through 900 and 1,100 bushels a day, and the weather was fine and cold and dry, and by the evening of the 12th of October they had finished 4 farms out of 11 and were set up in the yard at Pedder Rask's place, with the engine banked and the belt off. At about 3:30 in the afternoon of the 13th of October, 1882, with the belt running and a full crew and 1,100 bushels done since morning, the main cylinder shaft of that separator snapped. The cylinder is the heart of a threshing machine. It is a drum about 2 feet across and 3 feet long, set with rows of hardened steel teeth, and it runs at something over 1,000 revolutions a minute inside a concave of matching teeth, and everything the machine does happens in the 2 inches of space between them. The whole outfit exists to turn that drum. The belt from the engine drives it. It is the fastest moving thing on any farm in the United States in 1882 by a factor of about 10. The shaft that carries it, on a Minnesota Chief of that vintage, was a wrought iron shaft 2 1/8 inches in diameter and about 4 feet long, with a drum keyed to it and the pulley keyed to the drive end. It broke at the keyway on the pulley end, which is where they always broke, because a keyway is a square-cornered slot cut into a round shaft, and a square corner is where iron tears. It had been running, that shaft, since 1880. It had been through 3 seasons and something over 100,000 bushels, and it had been shock-loaded every time a slug of damp bundles went in, and there was, when they looked at the broken face afterward, an old brown crescent of fatigue crack across a third of it that had been growing for 2 years. It went at 3:30 in the afternoon, with the machine full. The pulley end came off the bearing, and the belt came off the flywheel, and took a header board, and 40 feet of it went across the yard like a whip. And by the greatest luck in the history of that township, nobody was standing where the belt went, and the drum ran itself down for a minute and a half with a noise that Pedder Rask's wife heard from inside the house and thought was the engine going up. And then it was quiet, and 11 men stood in a yard at 4 in the afternoon in the middle of October looking at a machine that had 1,100 bushels of somebody else's wheat inside it and would never turn again on that shaft. Tobias Rask sent his brother to town on a saddle horse before the dust settled. The telegram went to Minneapolis at 10 minutes past 6 on the 13th. The answer came back at 11 the next morning, and it is in the county museum in a frame, and what it said was, "Cylinder shaft Minnesota Chief pattern 11, not in stock this house. Can forward from works." Earliest delivery or station, 18 days. Advise, 18 days. The 14th of October plus 18 days is the 1st of November. And the ground in that valley froze hard on the 29th of October, 1882, which nobody knew yet on the 14th, but everybody could feel coming, and there were 7 farms and 9,000 bushels standing in the shock. Now, there were 3 ideas about what to do, and they were all tried, in order. And it is worth going through them because the order of them is the whole shape of that week. The first idea was another machine. Tobias Rask rode to Grandin on the 14th, 22 miles, and came back at midnight on the 15th, and the answer was no, and it was not an unkind no. The Grandin outfit had 19 farms of its own contracted and was 10 days behind and had turned down 4 other rings that week. There was nothing there. The second idea was a shaft out of something else. Emmett Sturdivant, who was in Crookston, was got hold of by telegram and spent the 15th and 16th ransacking 3 warehouses and a railroad shop and found one shaft that was near enough out of a wrecked machine of another make, and it was 2 3/8 inches and would have wanted the bearings bored out and the drum rekeyed, and it was. As he wired back, 9 days and a machine shop away, and there was no machine shop. The third idea was Ansel Byrne. They went to him on the 16th. Of course they did. He was the smith in that town. He had 11 years in it. He had shod every horse in that yard, and Almira Stauffer at that moment was 11 days out from a hay rack that had put a boy under a load in the middle of Front Street. He had the 2 pieces of that shaft in his shop from the 16th to the 19th of October, and he worked on it. And he worked hard, and it has to be said again that he was not lazy and he was not a fraud. He was a farrier, being asked to do machine work, and he did what a man in that position does, which is the thing he knows how to do, hoping it will be enough. He sleeved it. He made a wrought iron sleeve about 11 inches long, split lengthwise into 2 halves, and he set the 2 pieces of the shaft end to end in it and put 4 heavy bolts crosswise through the whole assembly, and he did it neatly, and the fit was good. Anybody who has ever run a machine already knows what happened. They hung it on the 19th and belted up at 9 in the morning with the whole ring standing in Peter Rask's yard and the engine at 40 pounds, and Tobias Rask let the belt on slow, and the cylinder came up to speed, and at something like 600 or 700 turns a minute, the assembly, which was out of balance because a split sleeve with 4 bolts through it cannot be balanced, began to run, and the whole separator started to walk, and the noise it made was a deep, fast knocking you could feel through the soles of your boots 11 feet away, and Tobias Rask threw the belt off inside of 40 seconds. They tried it again slower, and it knocked at half speed. At half speed, a cylinder does not thresh, it chews, and you get half the wheat out of the straw, and the rest goes over the tail with the chaff. And then they took it apart and found that in those 2 runs the bolt holes had already elongated, because bolts through a shaft that is trying to twist do not hold a shaft, they bruise it, and 100 more hours of that would have been 11 pounds of scrap and a bearing burnt out. Ansel Byrne stood in that yard on the 19th of October and looked at it and said, in front of 11 men, and to his credit he did say it, "I have done what can be done. That shaft wants a weld, and I am not a welder. I have never told any man in this county different, and there is a silence in every account of that afternoon." And then Ole Bratsberg said, in Norwegian first and then in English, "There is a welder in this town." Nobody said anything to that for a while. It was Chauncey Pratt, of all the people in the world, who went and got her, because Chauncey Pratt had by then made a personal specialty of being the man who admits a thing out loud in a yard full of men. And he drove down Front Street at 4 in the afternoon on the 19th of October and found her setting a wagon tire in the alley with Gustav Lem. She listened to the whole thing standing up with her hands on her hips. Then she asked 11 questions, one after another, and Chauncey Pratt could answer 4 of them. And for the rest she said, "Then I have to see it." And she got up on the seat beside him with her tool roll and her calipers and a lantern, and they drove 11 miles out to Peter Rask's place in the dark. She got there at 7:30, She looked at the shaft for 1 hour and 10 minutes by Pederask's kitchen clock, in the yard, with 4 lanterns and a crowd of men she made stand back, and she did not say one word for the first 40 minutes of it. What she was reading was this: where the break was, relative to the drum and the bearing. How much length there was to play with, what the iron was, which she determined by nicking it with a cold chisel and bending the nick, and it was good tough wrought, straight-grained, which was the best news of the night. Whether the shaft was bent anywhere else, which she checked by rolling both pieces on a plank with a straightage over them. How much of the original length she would lose in the weld, which for a proper jump weld on 2 1/8" stock is between 1 inch and 1 1/4 inches, and whether the machine could stand losing it, which meant crawling under the separator with a lantern and a dress at 41 years of age, except she was 27. And coming out with chaff in her hair to say that the pulley could come in 7/8 of an inch and no more before it fouled the frame. And then she stood up and told 11 men, in order, what it would take, and every man there afterward remembered it as the most frightening speech he ever heard, not because of what was in it, but because of how flat it was. She said, "I can do it." She said, "I am not going to sleeve it, because a sleeve is what you have already got, and you have seen what it does. I am going to make one piece of iron out of it, and when I am done, there will be no joint in that shaft at all." She said, to do it, I have to bring both ends to welding heat at the same minute, in the same fire. And that is a fire 4 times the size of the fire in my shop, and I have not got it, so I will build one tonight in the ground. And it will take 3 hours and a barrow of clay. She said, at that heat a 2-inch shaft is soft as a candle, and I cannot hold it in tongs at arm's length, so I want 2 men on each piece with a set of iron carrying bars I will make. And they will do exactly what I say and nothing else, and they will not be men who have been drinking. She said, I want a striker, and there is one, and somebody go and get Roof Burn. She said, and when it is welded, that is not the end of it. Welding a shaft is the easy half. It will come out of the fire a hair off true, and there will be an upset swell at the joint that has to come off, and the whole of it has to run inside a bearing to 1,000th part, or it will heat and seize. And I have got no lathe, and there is no lathe in this county, so I will true it on my anvil, and dress it with a file and a straightage, and I will check it in the bearing itself, and that is going to take longer than the weld, and I do not know how much longer. And any man who is going to ask me every hour how much longer should go home now. She said, I will cut you a new keyway with a chisel and a file, and it will not be in the old place, it will be a quarter turnaround from it, because the old place is where the iron already tore. And she said, last, I want it understood by every man here that I have never done this alone. I have done it 4 times, and every time my father was at the Anvil and I was on the sledge, and he is dead in January, and this is the first one where I am the one holding the tongs. Peter Rask said, Why are you telling us that? And Elmira Stauffer said, Because if it goes wrong, I want you to have heard me say it standing up, and not to find it out afterward from Ansel Byrne. She was hired that night for $25, which was more money than she had ever been paid for one job in her life, and which the 11 men of that ring subscribed on a piece of paper in Peter Rask's kitchen at 9 o'clock at night, and the paper survives. They brought the shaft into Belle Prairie at 11 at night, and she started on the fire before she started on anything else. The fire is the whole story, and nobody outside the trade understands that, so it is worth spending the time. Her shop forge was a hearth about 20 inches by 14 with a single tire in the middle of it, and it was correct for everything she had done that summer, and it was useless for this, because it could put one heat into one place, and this job needed 2 heats, 4 inches apart, in 2 separate pieces of iron, arriving at the same white greasy condition at the same instant, held there long enough for 4 men to lift both pieces out of the fire and cross them on an anvil. So she built a trench fire on the dirt floor of the Ketchum shop alongside the anvil in the old way, which is a rectangular trough about 4 feet long and 8 inches deep, walled, with rammed clay, with air brought in from her bellows through a scrap iron pipe split into 2 branches by a Y. She forged in 20 minutes, with a damper cut in each branch out of a piece of shovel blade so she could throttle one side against the other. She rammed the clay with the end of a fence post. She dried it with a slow wood fire for an hour and a half, and then cooked 100 pounds of Illinois coal on top of it in the dark, wetting the edges with a can, building the crust, working it with a poker every few minutes, and she would not let anybody help her with that part. Ruth Byrne came at midnight and did not say anything about it, and neither did she. While the fire was coming up, she made the tools she did not have. 4 carrying bars out of half-inch round with hooked ends and cranked handles so a man could carry a white-hot shaft at arm's length without the tongs slipping. A pair of tongs with a hollow bit big enough to take 2 1/8 round, forged out of an old buggy spring. A wooden trough of sand to lay the shaft in while it cooled slow, because a shaft quenched or chilled uneven will warp and will be hard in patches, and no file will touch it. And a shrink collar. The collar is the part that turned it from a good repair into the thing that is in the museum. She had decided, standing in Peter Rask's yard, that a plain jump weld on a shaft that runs 1,000 turns a minute made by one person at midnight in a dirt-floored shed with no way to test it was not enough, and that she wanted a second line of defense that did not depend on her being right. So she forged a ring. It was made out of a piece of old wagon tire, best wrought. Welded into a circle of an inside diameter that she turned and filed and measured with a set of calipers she checked 11 times, and the inside diameter was 3/64 of an inch smaller than the shaft. It was 3 inches wide and half an inch thick. The idea is thousands of years old, and it is the same idea as the tire on a wagon wheel, which she had set 40 of that summer. You make the ring under size, you heat it until it grows, you drop it on, and as it cools, it shrinks and grips with a pressure that nothing on earth will loosen. A shrunk collar over a welded joint puts the whole joint in compression and holds it there for as long as the metal lasts. She made it in 2 hours between 1 and 3 in the morning, and she made it while a fire she had spent 3 hours building sat there getting exactly right, which every smith who has ever read this account has said is the most impressive detail in it, because it means she had the nerve to leave a good fire alone. At 3:30 in the morning of the 20th of October, 1882, she took her boots off, which she always did for heavy work because she said she needed the floor, and she put the 2 halves of that shaft into the trench fire. Before the weld there was the upsetting, and that took from 3:30 until 6:20, and it was the part that broke people. Both broken ends had to be thickened, the same way the bridge rod had been thickened, from 2 1/8 up to about 2 5/8, so that the weld would have meat in it, and so that when the swell was dressed off there would still be full section at the joint. That is done by heating 8 inches of the end of a shaft to yellow and standing it on the anvil and driving it back on itself, and a shaft of that weight cannot be held by one person and driven by another. It has to be held by 2 men on carrying bars while the smith positions it and the striker hits it, and the smith cools the shoulder with a wet swab between every 3rd blow so the swell stays where she wants it. They did 6 heats aside, somewhere over 400 blows of a 16-pound sledge, and every one of them landed where a woman with a hand hammer said it should land. And by 6 in the morning, Ruth Byrne's shirt was through, and Ole Bratsberg had taken over one of the carrying bars from a man whose arms had gone, and Elmira Stauffer had not sat down since 11 o'clock the previous night. Then she scarfed both ends. That is fine work with a hand hammer and a set hammer on the horn of the anvil, drawing each thickened end into a shallow domed wedge, crowned in the middle so the centers meet first, and it took her 40 minutes, and she did all of it herself, with nobody touching anything, and it is the part that decides whether the rest of the night is worth anything. At 7:10 in the morning, in the gray before sunrise, she put both ends in the trench fire, one in each branch of the blast, and put Ruth Byrne on the bellows, and told him the rhythm, and told him not to change it if the building fell down. There were, by then, about 30 people in and around the door of the Ketchum shop, because Belle Prairie had had all night to hear about it. They had been arriving since 4. Orpha Dowd was there with a coffee pot she had carried 1,100 feet from her kitchen and had been refilling since 2:30. Chauncey Pratt was there. Emmett Sturtevant had come up from Crookston on the night train specifically and had been sitting on a keg by the door since 5 in the morning with his hat on his knees, saying nothing, watching a fire. And Ansel Byrne was standing outside in the dark across the alley, where he had been since about 4, and where 3 separate people saw him, and nobody said anything to him. She threw the borax on at 14 minutes past 7. There is a description of the last 4 minutes of that weld from 4 different people, and they agree closely, and the closest is Emmett Sturtevant's, who wrote it out in a letter to the works in Minneapolis 11 days later, because he wanted somebody in an office to understand what he had watched. He wrote that the fire went from red to yellow to a white that hurt to look at, and that the whole inside of that shed lit up like a furnace door, and every face in the doorway went orange, and that she stood over it with her forearms up and her face turned half away, looking at the edge of the light and not the middle of it, and that she was completely still. He wrote that she said, without raising her voice, bars, and that 4 men came in and hooked on. He wrote that she said, up, and that a great white bar of iron came out of the ground. And he wrote this, which is the sentence that got the letter kept: the 2 ends were brought together over the anvil. And she took them in her tongs and crossed them and struck once with the small hammer. And there came out of the joint a spray of white fire that went across the floor and up the far wall, and she said, hit. And I have never, in 22 years in this business, heard a woman's voice in a shop, and I did not think of it at the time, and I have thought of it since. 11 blows. Turn. 11 blows. Turn. Turn again. The joint went from 2 ends to one thing in about 18 seconds, and then she tapped the anvil face twice, and Roof Burns stopped, and stood there with the sledge up and his mouth open, and she put it straight back into the fire for a second heat and welded it again all the way round, which is a thing the trade calls sweetening, and which nobody in that shed had ever heard of. And then a third heat to draw the swell down, and then she took it out and laid it on the anvil and looked at it. She turned it over twice. Then she said, to nobody in particular, in the voice of a woman reading a bill of lading, that's a weld. And the door of the Ketchum shop came apart with a noise that woke up the west half of Belle Prairie. The weld was at 21 minutes past 7 in the morning. She was not finished until 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. That is the part that nobody puts in the story when they tell it in a bar, and she used to get impatient about it in her old age, because the 9 hours after the weld are the reason the shaft ran for 31 years instead of 14 days. She dressed the swell down with a flatter and a file, then with a file alone, working to a straightage and a pair of calipers, going round and round that shaft, taking off 2 thousandths at a time, checking, taking off 2 more. She trued it by rolling it on the flat of the anvil and watching the light under it and tapping the high side cold with a wooden mallet, which is a trick that is either magic or 40 years of practice, depending on who is describing it. She checked it in the machine's own bearing brasses, which Petter Rask brought in a bucket 4 separate times, carrying that shaft the 11 feet from bench to bearing on her shoulder, and the 4th time it went round in the brass with a film of oil and no daylight and no drag at all. She cut the new keyway a quarter turn from the old one with a cold chisel and finished it with a square file, by eye, to fit the key, and it took her 2 hours and 10 minutes, and it is dead square. And at 3 in the afternoon she heated the collar in her own forge to a dull red so that it grew, and 4 men held the shaft level in the sand trough. And she picked that ring up in a pair of tongs, and dropped it over the end of the shaft, and drove it 11 inches along to the joint with 2 blows of a wooden mallet, and it stopped, and gripped, and as it cooled, you could hear it, a series of small clear ticks over about a minute, which is the sound of a ring of iron closing down on a shaft with a force of some thousands of pounds, and which everybody in that shed who was still alive in 1931 still talked about. She poured water on it at 4:10, and it steamed and went black, and it was done. They belted up at Pederask's at 10 minutes to 9 on the morning of the 21st of October, 1882. There were, by the count in the Clarion, upward of 200 people in that yard, which is a considerable proportion of a township, and they had come because it had gone around the valley overnight. And there was a table of food out, and somebody had a fiddle, and it had the shape of a public event, which Tobias Rask hated, and which he could do nothing about. Almira Stauffer was not standing on the machine, and she was not standing next to it. She had been up for 34 hours by then, and she was sitting on a chair in the middle of that yard, 40 feet back, which Tobias Rask had carried out of Pederask's kitchen and set down for her without asking her whether she wanted it, and which was the first chair anybody in Minnesota had ever put under her without her having to ask. The engine came up to pressure. Tobias Rask took the belt in both hands and looked across at her. She nodded. He let it on slow, the way he did everything, and the cylinder came up. 600. 800. It went past the speed where the sleeve had knocked, and there was nothing. No knock, no walk, nothing but the rising howl a threshing cylinder makes when it is running true, and it came up to full, and Tobias Rask stood there with his hand on the belt guide for 11 seconds, listening to it, and then took his hand off. And Ole Bratsberg, who was on the feeder deck with a bundle already in his hands, cut the band on it and put the first sheaf of the 21st of October into that machine, and the note of the cylinder dropped a half tone and came back up, which is the sound a good machine makes eating, and the straw came out the back. The Belle Prairie Clarion, which had printed a joke about the manufacture of smoke on the 13th of July, printed 11 column inches about the 21st of October, and the last line of it is the only sentence that newspaper ever wrote that is quoted anywhere today. It said there was no cheering on account of nobody being able to hear anything, and most of the men had their hats off, and we are not going to pretend we know why. They threshed 7 farms in 8 days. The ground froze on the 29th of October, which was 4 days after they finished, and the first snow came on the 3rd of November. And the 14,000 and some bushels of the Rask ring went into the elevator at Belle Prairie between the 22nd of October and the 2nd of November at an average of 83 cents. 11 notes were paid at the Belle Prairie Bank between the 1st of November and the 15th of December, 1882, and not one farm in that ring changed hands that winter. 4 farms in that township that were not in the ring and that had been waiting on a machine out of Grandine did not get threshed until the middle of March, out of stacks that had been under the snow. And 2 of them went to the courthouse door in the spring of 1883, and one of them was a man who had stood on the platform on the 22nd of May and said the thing about counterweighting the car. Nobody in this story ever said one word to him about it, then or later, which in a township of that size is its own kind of monument. Emmett Sturdivant came back on the 8th of November with a set of machinist's calipers and a straightedge and spent an afternoon at Pederask's yard measuring a shaft that was running, and then wrote his letter to Minneapolis, and in January of 1883 the House appointed the Ketchum shop at Belle Prairie its repair agency for 4 townships, which meant a discount, a parts book, a standing order, and a printed card that she never put in the window because she said a shop that needs a card is a shop that has not been open long enough. Ansel Byrne came on a Tuesday night in the first week of December after dark in the snow and knocked, which nobody in Belle Prairie did. He had his own hand hammer with him and a piece of 1-inch round in a sack. He stood inside the door and did not take his hat off and did not sit down, and he said, "I am not going to say anything about the summer, because you would not believe it, and I would not blame you." And then he put the sack on the bench and said, "I want to learn to weld, and there is nobody in 400 miles but you, and I will pay whatever you say." Almira Stauffer looked at him for a long time. Then she said, take your coat off. She taught him on Tuesday and Thursday nights from December of 1882 until the middle of March, and she took no money for it, and she said afterward, when people asked her why on earth she had done it, that she had thought about it for about 4 seconds and had realized that there was not going to be a day in her life when she was going to enjoy anything as much as she was going to. Enjoy being asked, and that a person should be careful with a pleasure like that and not spoil it by charging for it. He learned. He was 50 by then, and he never got fast at it, and he never did machine work. But he could put an eye on a rod by the spring of '83, and he did it for 11 more years in that town, and he told people where he had learned it. He died in 1894, and she shut her shop for the funeral and was one of 8 people who carried him, which caused comment and which she said was nobody's business. Ruth Byrne came to her in January and asked to be bound to her for 3 years, which his uncle had told him to do and which he had already decided to do before he was told. He served 4, took over the machine work in 1889, and ran that shop after her from 1912, and there is a photograph of him in 1938, 65 years old, with white hair, standing at the same anvil on the same elm block, and he told the county paper that year that he had been the striker on the bridge rod at 19 and that he had been hooting at that woman in the dark 6 weeks before it, and that she had never once mentioned it to him in 56 years, and that, not mentioning, it was the way she got him, and that he had known it at the time and had let it happen. Tobias Rask asked her to marry him on the 4th of March, 1883, standing in the door of the Ketchum shop in his good coat with his hat in both hands, and made a considerable mess of it. He had a speech. He had been working on it since about the middle of October, and he got perhaps 11 words into it before it came apart in his hands, and then he stood there, and then he said the thing he had not planned to say, which was, "I am not asking you to come and keep my house. I keep it. I have kept it 9 years, and I keep it well. I am asking whether I may come into yours, and carry coal, and be told what to hit." And Almira Stauffer, who was 28 years old, and who had been laughed at by 60 people on a railway platform in that county 9 months before, put both hands flat on the doorframe and put her head down and cried for the second time in Minnesota, and then wiped her face with the corner of her apron and said yes, and then, because she was who she was, said, "And you will have to hit better than you think, because I have seen you swing, and you look at the hammer." He said, "I know I do. I have been practicing since November on a stump." They were married on the 12th of April, 1883, in the Norwegian church because it was the bigger building, by a Methodist minister, which nobody in that township ever entirely got over. And Orpha Dowd stood up with her, and Merit Hiel made the dress, and the shop was open the following morning at 6. She kept the farm and the shop both, which meant 11 miles twice a day for 2 years until they built the house on the town lot in 1885, and she never in her life let anybody call the shop by his name, and the account at the Belle Prairie Bank stayed in hers, and when the sign finally went up over that door in 1886, it was 3 words long, and the first one was hers. She bought a trip hammer in 1890, the first in that county, a 50-pound Bradley runoff, a 2-horsepower gasoline engine, and she said the day it was set up that she had spent 19 years being a striker and had just bought one for $40 down, and that it did not talk back, and it also did not bring the coffee, so it came out about even. The shop made the ironwork for the new steel bridge approaches in 1896, and the hardware for the school in 1901. And the hinges and the bell yoke for the church that replaced the church she was married in, and it shod horses too after 1894 when there was nobody else to do it. And she never got good at it, and always said so out loud, and sent the bad feet to a man in Crookston. They had 3 children. A daughter in 1884 who taught school and then ran the county schools for 22 years. A son in 1886 who died at 4 of scarlet fever and whose name is on the stone with theirs. and a son in 1890 who went to the State University and became a mechanical engineer and worked 41 years for a farm machinery company in Illinois designing, among other things, cylinder shafts. Tobias Rask died in 1919 at 71 of the influenza in the second wave in the front room of the house on the town lot. She ran the shop with Ruth Byrne for 10 years after that. She got heavier as she got older, and her knees were finished by 50. There were chairs kept for her all over that township by the end, at the elevator and in the bank and in Pater Rask's kitchen and at the church door, all of them built to one measure. Most of them built by her husband, and after 1919 by her son, and by Ruth Byrne. And there was one in the corner of the shop by the fire that nobody else ever sat in, and that is in the museum, too. She died on the 2nd of February, 1929, at 74 years of age, in her own bed, in the middle of a blizzard, having worked at the fire 2 days before, and the funeral was put off 4 days for the weather, and when they finally had it there were people standing in the snow outside the church because there was no room, and the Clarion said that in 51 years of that town's existence nothing like it had ever been seen. The shop stood until 1954. Ruth Byrne ran it until 1941, and then his son ran it as a garage with the Ford still in the back corner, and the elm block never moved. And when the building came down for a state highway, the County Historical Society got the anvil, and the legvis, and the tongs, and the tobacco tin, with 15 lumps of iron pyrites in it, and a wrapping paper notice, brittle and brown, that had been folded in the back of a ledger for 71 years. The Peter Wright anvil is in a glass case in that museum now with a light over it, and the card beside it gives the weight and the maker and the date it came into the county. What the card does not say, because a card cannot hold it, is that on a morning in May of 1882 two grown men dropped that anvil on a depot platform in front of 60 people who were already laughing, and that the woman it belonged to stood on the bottom step of a day coach with a folded note in her pocket telling her that the man she had come 340 miles to marry was gone to Idaho, and that she had $10, and that she came down that step at her own speed and let them look. The shaft is there, too, on 2 brackets on the wall. They took it out of the Minnesota chief in 1913 when the ring bought a new machine, and it went into a corner of the shop, and in 1931, when the county published its history for the 50th anniversary, somebody hung it on the wall of the courthouse annex with a wire, and in 1968 it came to the museum. It is 4 feet long and 2 1/8 inches through, and there is a wrought iron collar shrunk on the middle of it, 3 inches wide, and under that collar, invisible, is a place where 2 pieces of a broken shaft were made into one piece at 21 minutes past 7 in the morning on the 20th of October, 1882, by a woman who had been awake for 20 hours and who welded it twice because once was not enough for her. That shaft threshed in the Red River Valley for 31 seasons after it broke, and in the county history of 1931 there is a paragraph about her, written by a committee of 4, 3 of whom were women who had been girls in that township in the 1880s, and it ends with a sentence that people in that county still say to each other, usually about something else entirely, and usually without knowing where it came from. It says, they laughed at her on the platform for what she weighed, and 11 months later the whole of this township was standing in a yard in the cold, waiting to find out whether the weight of her had been enough.